Hello and welcome to Expert Speak. In this episode, we'll try to unpack the emerging geopolitical dynamics in the Bay of Bengal. In the recent years, the Bay of Bengal has emerged as the new locus of strategic competition among the major powers. The Bay of Bengal is home to one fourth of the world's population. It also hosts one of the world's busiest shipping lanes and is rich in marine resources, including petroleum and natural gas reserves. Today, our guest is Dr. David Brewster. I want to start our conversation with the most dominant discourse on the Bay of Bengal in the recent years, which of course is um, the Bay of Bengal, has become a theater of strategic competition among major powers, where their interests sort of intersect in this water body. In some areas they cooperate, in some areas it converge, in some areas they compete. How would you describe the state of geopolitical power play in the Bay of Bengal today? And what are the strategic drivers what are the key drivers of this strategic competition and cooperation in the Bay of Bengal?
Right. Okay. So I suppose for a start, it's important not to overstate the level of competition that currently exists in the Bay of Bengal area. There's certainly competition and it's certainly growing, but it's not to the extent, anywhere near to the extent, for example, we might see in the South China Sea area. But I suppose the concern is that if you look at the map, the two waterways that connect the Pacific and Indian Ocean are the South China Sea and the Bay of Bengal. Now, we know that for some years, the South China Sea has become a real focus point of strategic competition between China and the United States and all of the Southeast Asian countries. And there certainly there's concerns that strategic competition between major powers could really heat up in the Bay of Bengal area. There's a lot of differences. One is that the big powers in the Bay of Bengal area are different. The two big powers that are competing with each other are China and India, and not China and the United States. So that creates quite different dynamics. Also, the dynamics in the Bay of Bengal area is really drastically affected by the fact that many of the countries in the Bay of Bengal area are direct neighbours of India, and they have very long shared histories, shared ethnicities and languages, etc. And so that makes the relationships quite difficult. So, for example, India's relations with some of its neighbours, such as Sri Lanka or Bangladesh, can be rather difficult, reflecting I suppose the shared baggage of history. So, if one compares the South China Sea and the Bay of Bengal, there's certainly reasons to think that competition will grow in the Bay of Bengal area, but it will look quite different from Southeast Asia.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, in fact, a related issue is also the role of smaller littoral nations as the strategic competition among the major powers intensifies in the Bay of Bengal. The role of the smaller littoral countries. Um, in fact, there have been these smaller littoral countries have been playing a balancing role or a balancing game to maximize benefits and also to avoid putting all the eggs in one basket. Um, Now, this is very visible in the case of Myanmar, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, particularly in port infrastructure development. Now, we have also seen in recent years, uh, you know, Sri Lanka and Myanmar witnessing some very serious political crisis. How do you see the impact of domestic politics of the smaller littoral nations on the geopolitics of the Bay of Bengal?
Yeah. So look, the smaller countries, as this strategic competition between India and China grows, the smaller countries assume more and more importance, and this strategic competition affects smaller countries in a couple of different or several different ways. And I'll call Bangladesh a smaller country just for these purposes, even though with 170 million people, it's one of the most populous countries in the world. But let's treat it as smaller, certainly in comparison to India and China. So it affects these smaller countries in several different ways. One is that competition, as the big powers jostle for influence in these countries, it destabilizes them. Destabilizes their political systems, their economic systems, even their social systems, and can have a lot of adverse consequences for these countries. But at the same time, it also gives these smaller countries greater power, potentially, in terms of trying to, as you said, maximize their potential benefits that they can gain from each side, whether it be in aid or investment or other political benefits, for example. The problem is that it's a very difficult path to follow, because if the smaller country doesn't watch out, they could come a cropper and be destabilized and sort of be almost treated as pawns by the bigger countries, who may want to sort of place one of their or put in power someone who they see is beneficial to them, while the other great power, does the opposite. So it's a very difficult path to follow for the smaller countries. There's a lot of very difficult choices. They have to be very careful how they position themselves. And some smaller countries don't do it well. Now, Sri Lanka is sometimes used as an example of a country that has really come a cropper because of strategic competition between India and China. And obviously, we saw Sri Lanka suffer a major economic and political crisis in the last year or two. I think it would be certainly not right to attribute that crisis to completely to big power competition, but certainly I think it's fair to say that big power competition contributed to the causes of that crisis. So, for example, China was lending a lot of money in many cases on projects that didn't make economic sense, which added to Sri Lanka's interest bill. But I think even more importantly, the former government under President Rajapaksa, they assumed that China would keep on lending no matter what. And so that led to very much a lack of discipline by the government in how much it lent or in what projects it spent money on. And in my view, that was a significant contributor to the crisis that that Sri Lanka faced. Now, other countries around the region, not just in the Bay of Bengal, have been able to fairly successfully navigate this difficult path. We see in Seychelles, for example, the island state of Seychelles, one of the smallest countries in the world. It has, for much of its history as an independent country, it's been able to navigate between the big countries, previously between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and now between India and China. Bangladesh also, I think, in my view, is doing quite a reasonable job in navigating its way between India and China. Bangladesh is obviously almost entirely surrounded on its land borders by India, and it doesn't want to become completely dependent upon India. It wants to have other choices. One of those other choices has been to take investments from China. That's a rational thing for Bangladesh to do, but it has to be careful to do that in a way that doesn't threaten India. Now, we see what happened in various port proposals, which is a real sort of touch point or controversial issue. Who builds the port is seen as a very important strategic issue. Now, there are a lot of proposals by China to develop Sonadia Port south of Chittagong, but the Bangladesh government ultimately decided to go with Japanese investment to develop Matabari Port. And I think that was a clever decision because it was a way of Bangladesh avoiding this strategic controversy and working with an alternative partner to build the infrastructure that it wants. Instead, much of Chinese investment is directed on other projects that are strategically less controversial. Now, that's not to say that Bangladesh may not make mistakes in the future. It's under a real balance of payments constraints at the moment due to energy prices, etc. But I think one has to say that compared with many other countries in the region, Bangladesh has done reasonably well in navigating this very difficult path between the big countries.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, one of the ideas around the Bay of Bengal is building a Bay of Bengal community. In fact, since the late 90s, there have been efforts to build a Bay of Bengal community in the form of BIMSTEC. But the process has been very slow. And in fact, from the beginning, the grouping has been very much an economic project. There's been very little effort to push for or to develop a political project around this idea. What are the structural challenges that you see in building a Bay of Bengal community in the Bay of Bengal? I mean, how do you see this process evolving in the Bay?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. Look, if you go back in history into colonial times and before then, the Bay of Bengal really operated as very much as a single economic entity with trade flows and people flows back and forth across the bay, and that really stopped with decolonization and the independence. And in addition, for I suppose a lot of reasons, a line was drawn right down the middle of the bay between, and people started to talk about Southeast Asia on one side and South Asia on the other side. And Southeast Asia had its own political arrangements, which evolved into ASEAN, and South Asia had its own arrangements, such as SARC. And that left many countries in the Bay of Bengal. I suppose it just reinforced the dislocation, that the economic and political and human dislocation that we saw in the Bay of Bengal with decolonization, and really left the countries around the Bay of Bengal with much less options. South Asian countries were supposed to be looked to India for their key economic relationships. Southeast Asian countries had their own arrangements. So certainly there's good reason to think that there should be and could be a political and economic community among Bay of Bengal countries, and the BIMSTEC initiative was a valuable initiative. Unfortunately, as you pointed out, it really hasn't met its promise. It hasn't developed as it could have. And there's a whole lot of reasons for that. One is just simply the lack of physical connectivity. So the lack of roads connecting one side of the Bay of Bengal to the other, the lack of ports and shipping connections across the bay. But also there's a lot of political reasons. One is, for example, at the moment, certainly Myanmar, the status of Myanmar, and particularly since the military coup there, and Myanmar's treatment of the Rohingya people, the fact that they've expelled the Rohingya people from their territory and who fled to Bangladesh. So that creates a real divide between Bangladesh and Myanmar, and real threat perceptions, which inhibit really significant cooperation. Also, I think I think the agenda of BIMSTEC is not as broad as it could be. There's very for reasons which I'm not really sure of, there's very little focus on maritime affairs, whether it be blue economy or maritime security issues such as refugees or piracy or illegal fishing and the like. And so there are many good reasons why the countries around the Bay of Bengal could benefit from cooperation, but we're just not seeing that happening at the moment.
Sure. Well, you mentioned about the China factor in the Bay of Bengal. In fact, China's increasing foray in the Bay of Bengal has raised concerns in India, and a subject that has long been a geopolitical controversy is the Cocoa Islands of Myanmar. Since the early 90s, there's been speculation that claims that Myanmar has allowed a Chinese intelligence facility on the Cocoa Islands. The latest speculation is that China is helping to construct a listening post and extending an airstrip on the Cocoa Islands. From your long-drawn research on the Bay, what can you share about the state of militarization on the Cocoa Islands?
Okay, so I suppose the military relationship between Myanmar and China can be traced back to 1988, when both those countries found themselves on the outer, which sort of gave them good reason to cooperate and draw together. And as you pointed out, I think in the late 90s or so, there started to be speculation about a Chinese electronic intelligence gathering post having been built on Coco Island. Great, I think it's Great Coco Island. That, I think, was simply speculation. There was never any proof. It was just you can trace it back to a single journalist writing out of Japan, actually, which was just repeated again and again and again by other journalists. And in fact, the Myanmar government ultimately invited representatives from India to come and visit the island, and subsequently the Indian Navy confirmed that there in fact was no intelligence gathering facility on the island. However, in recent times, just some months ago, it became evident that a large airstrip was being developed on the island, which would be suitable, or potentially suitable, for use by maritime surveillance aircraft. Now, there is, and that would certainly be a very significant concern to India if that was true. There's not as yet any real evidence as to how this airstrip is being used, and there's no evidence of it being used by Chinese aircraft. But certainly it seems that, the facilities are there and it could be used by Chinese aircraft in a contingency. So again, I think it would be in Myanmar's interests to talk with India about this facility, to explain the reasons why Myanmar has chosen to build this facility, and hopefully reduce threat perceptions by India. Now, let's be clear. This is on Myanmar territory. Myanmar has every right to build an airstrip on one of its own islands. So it's not illegitimate, if you like, by action by Myanmar. It's just simply something that they have done that has raised threat perceptions, and in my view, it would be in their interests to avoid those threat perceptions existing.
Sure. Now, coming to India, India has been setting a precedent. One is in respecting the rule of law by settling its maritime boundary dispute with Bangladesh to an international arbitration, and India has also been taking a lead in responding to HADR operations in the Bay of Bengal as a first responder. And it has also been taking a pivotal role in maritime security cooperation by initiating multilateral, minilateral, plurilateral initiatives in the Bay of Bengal. As a regional power, or the regional power in the Bay of Bengal, um, India's role in the Bay gives us a glimpse on India's ambitions and ability to play a larger role in the maritime domain in the Indo-Pacific region, in establishing an order, maritime order that is based on the rule of law, free, open, inclusive, Indo-Pacific. How do you see India's role in the Bay of Bengal today?
Yes, absolutely. Look, I think India, certainly in the maritime domain, there are other issues that it has with its neighbours, for example, in relation to water sharing disputes with Bangladesh, etc. But let's put those aside and just look at purely the Bay of Bengal maritime domain. India really has been a good international citizen. As you said, it agreed that this boundary dispute with Bangladesh should be submitted to international arbitration, and then it respected the result of that arbitration, which didn't necessarily go in India's favour. But it was a decision by India that everyone would benefit if those boundaries were settled in a peaceful manner. And so that's very much to India's credit. India has also, as you said, really put itself forward as a first responder in the Bay of Bengal and the broader Indian Ocean in terms of responding to natural disasters and other problems in the country, within Indian Ocean countries, and that puts India forward as a good neighbour, a neighbour that can be trusted to help out when needed. Now, of course, India is not doing this simply for altruistic reasons. It's looking to build its influence among countries and have those countries prefer India as a security provider compared with other choices such as China. As I mentioned, in some countries, India also needs to overcome a lot of historical baggage. For example, with Sri Lanka, stemming from historical issues, including India's support of Tamil separatists in past decades, and similarly in Bangladesh for a whole lot of reasons, which you know far better than I. There's certainly at the popular level in Bangladesh, there's a high degree of resentment against India for various historical reasons, and it's a complicated relationship, I suppose you could put it that way. And so India is doing what it can to be seen as a good citizen and a good neighbour, but I think it will take a lot more time for that message to get through right down to the popular level.
Well, maybe the last question. The Bay of Bengal has also witnessed numerous non-traditional security threats, including tsunamis, cyclones, climate change, forced migration, illegal narcotic trade, gun running, and unregulated migration, fishing. Now, all these issues require a comprehensive region-wide policy framework. But so far, that the process towards having a regional approach to these issues has been, very very difficult, and we are still very far away from that situation. Um, how do you see pattern of cooperation among the key littoral countries in the Bay of Bengal, uh, developing that pattern of cooperation in at least dealing with these common challenges in the Bay of Bengal?
Yeah. Look, again, that's a great question. As you point out, there are a lot of shared security threats among littoral states, whether that it be illegal fishing or uh, smuggling, drug smuggling, or HADR, or indeed marine pollution, um, in which can only be resolved through cooperation with all countries. None of those issues can be resolved by one country acting alone. And yet, um, there at the moment there aren't these structures to facilitate cooperation. BIMSTEC really hasn't stepped up, particularly in the maritime space. And as we discussed earlier, there's these political roadblocks why it's very difficult for it to. But otherwise, the Bay of Bengal is one of the least structured areas, or having one of the areas of the world with the least cooperation between countries. And so my view is that the best way forward with cooperation is to take it on an issue by issue basis, and particularly at an operational level. And so to try and avoid the politics as much as possible, the reality is when you look at a lot of these issues where Coast Guards have responsibilities, there's actually quite good operational cooperation among Coast Guards in the Bay of Bengal and not between the governments. So I would suggest that you take these issues one at a time and try and bring together the responsible agencies, the agencies who are directly responsible for those problems, whether it be fishing, illegal fishing, or pollution control, or disaster relief, etc. Bring them together in a non-political environment and get them to start working together in an operational sense and build trust that way, and gradually that can develop into a more comprehensive arrangements. But you start with particular issues that are of shared concern, where everyone understands that that issue threatens all of us, and that we can all benefit from our cooperation on that issue.
Mm-hmm. David, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.